I told you to stop this demolition immediately!
And I told you to get off my property!
Before I make you!
I was checking my security cameras when I saw the trucks pull up flatbeds, skid steers. A full crew in hard hats walking around my $10 million lake house like they owned the place. No knock, no warning. They just started tearing it apart. First the dock, custom built, fully permitted, worth $200,000, ripped out in sections and thrown in a dumpster. Then they moved uphill. Chainsaws through my trees, sledgehammers through my stone walls. Then they started on the house itself, roof sections, railings, glass panels from the lakeside wall, just pulling them down, stacking them up, letting them shatter on the ground. 8. I watched the whole thing happen live on my security feed. Watched them destroy 3 days' worth of my property. And I didn't call the police. Didn't get an injunction. Didn't lift a finger to stop it. It's the HOA from the development next door had sent them. They'd been operating under the assumption my property was part of their community. Nobody had bothered to check the actual property records in 40 years. So when they decided my lake house blocked their premium water views, they sent me a violation notice demanding I lower my roof line and remove my dock. When I ignored it, they did what HOAs do when they think they have absolute authority. They hired contractors and took matters into their own hands. What they didn't know: I own the land their entire neighborhood sits on. Every house, every road, every foot of drainage pipe, a private beach they call community shoreline. All of it. Mine. A ground lease their developer signed in 1984 that nobody remembered existed except me, because I'd inherited it 6 months earlier. And I let them tear my house apart because I needed them to. Needed them on camera. Needed millions in documented damages. Needed them so confident in their authority that they'd show up in court and try to defend what they'd done. When we got there, their lawyer spent 20 minutes explaining HOA enforcement powers and community standards and architectural guidelines. The judge listened patiently. Then she asked one simple question. "Counselor, does your HOA own the land this property sits on?" Silence, because the answer was no. They didn't own my land. They didn't own their own land. They owned nothing but the buildings sitting on property I controlled. And just like that, their entire defense collapsed. They didn't just lose the case. They lost their ground lease, lost the right to exist as a community. Lost 40 years of assumed authority in a single court session when the judge realized they'd destroyed millions in property they had zero legal right to touch. The HOA president, personally liable for the full value of everything they destroyed. The board members who authorized it is being sued into bankruptcy. And the neighborhood they thought they controlled, facing eviction the moment I choose not to renew a lease that expires in 6 months. They wanted to tear down my house to protect their view. I let them. And then I took everything they thought they owned. But let me start from the beginning. Before we dive into, I'd love to know where you're listening from today. And don't forget to hit the like and subscribe buttons for more interesting stories just like this. The lake house was never meant to draw attention. It sat back from the water, framed by old-growth trees and a private shoreline that curved naturally with the land. Glass, stone, and timber followed the slope as if the structure had emerged there on its own. At just over $10 million, it was one of the most valuable properties on the lake, yet invisible from the road. No gates, no signage, no announcement of ownership. That was deliberate. The narrator held title outright, supported by layers of permits, shoreline exemptions, and historical variances that predated most of the surrounding development. Every approval had been issued, renewed, and grandfathered through multiple zoning regimes. On paper, the property was unremarkably legally clean, thoroughly documented, and uncontroversial. Paper, however, has never stopped an HOA. Next door sat a densely packed lakeside community governed by a homeowners association that treated uniformity as doctrine, identical roofs, regulated paint palettes, prescribed dock dimensions. Board meetings were infamous hours spent debating grass height, mailbox placement, and fines issued with quiet satisfaction. Residents learned quickly, compliance was cheaper than resistance. From the HOA's perspective, the lake house was a problem. It was larger, set higher, positioned farther back. Its shoreline remained uninterrupted. Its dock didn't conform to the community template. And most unforgivable of all, it disrupted the premium lake views the HOA relied on in marketing materials. So the board started talking. At first, cautiously. Mentions in meetings about the structure up the hill, concerns framed as stewardship, shoreline continuity, visual harmony, community character. Language that sounded responsible till repeated often enough to resemble entitlement. What surfaced instead was a holding company listed on the deed lawful, opaque, and intentionally silent. No replies, no objections, no attorneys returning calls. Just absence. The HOA mistook that absence for vulnerability. Board members began walking the boundary line with clipboards, standing on association docks, and measuring sight lines. Photos were taken. Its bylaws were highlighted sections that had never applied beyond the HOA's jurisdiction. Conversation shifted from speculation to assumption. Then came the notice. It appeared one morning, posted neatly in a clear plastic sleeve where it couldn't be ignored. The letter cited violations of view corridor preservation, shoreline aesthetic, consistency, and community standards alignment. At the bottom was the penalty. $200, not per day, not recurring. A single fines, fall enough to feel symbolic. What the HOA didn't realize was that every claim in the notice was legally incorrect. The property lay outside the association's authority. The bylaws terminated at the deeded boundary. The permits they alleged were missing had been approved decades earlier before the HOA existed at all. The narrator did not respond. No call, no letter. The silence was interpreted exactly as the board wanted it to be. At the next meeting, the tone changed. This was no longer about a fine it was about precedent. About proving that no structure, no matter how valuable, could exist beyond HOA control. Members spoke confidently about corrective measures and restoring balance to the shoreline. The vote was unanimous. From a distance, the narrator observed quietly. Emails were forwarded, minutes were archived, contractors were discussed, timelines were outlined. The $200 notice had never been enforcement. It was authorization. And the HOA had no idea what they were about to damage or who they had decided to test. The narrator continued to do nothing. For now, the trucks arrived just after sunrise. Unmarked at first glance, but unmistakable once equipment started rolling off the flatbed skid steers. Cutting tools, dumpsters, palletized materials. Contractors in reflective vests walked the shoreline with clipboards, pointing and nodding as if the property were already theirs. No one knocked, no one called. No one asked permission. They started immediately. The dock went first. It had been custom-built years earlier, engineered for fluctuating water levels, fully permitted, environmentally approved, and documented in county records. None of that mattered. The crew cut it loose without hesitation, dragging sections onto shore like scrap. Pilings were ripped free. Hardware tossed aside, metal screamed, wood cracked. The sound carried across the lake. Neighbors gathered along the waterline. Some filmed, a few argued with the crew. Most just stood there, stunned, watching something expensive and irreplaceable come apart piece by piece. When questioned, the contractors gave the same answer every time. HOA authorized corrective action. Then they moved uphill. Landscaping was next. Mature trees were cut back to stumps. Stone retaining walls were broken apart and hauled off. Native plants protected species included were ripped out and dumped like yard waste. Irrigation lines were severed. Lighting systems smashed and discarded. Still no notice. Still no court order. Still no legal authority. And then they touched the house. Not demolition, worse. Selective damage. Architectural elements removed because they allegedly violated visual harmony. Roof overhangs cut back. Exterior stone partially dismantled. Custom railings unbolted and hauled away. Glass panels removed and stacked carelessly, several shattering under their own weight. Each change reduced the value of the structure. Each action erased hundreds of thousands of dollars. Together, the damage climbed into the millions. From the HOA's perspective, this was enforcement. At the next board meeting, the tone was openly celebratory. The minutes would later reflect phrases like decisive action, restored compliance, and sending a message. One board member joked about how inexpensive it had been to fix a problem house. Another bragged that even luxury properties fall in line eventually. They referenced the original $200 fine repeatedly, as if it justified everything that followed. What they didn't know was that the narrator had documented every second, not from the property itself, but through remote cameras, third-party monitoring, and aerial footage. Drone video captured the site before, during, and after the work. License plates were logged. Contractor invoices were copied. Emails authorizing the work were archived. Board meeting recordings were downloaded and transcribed. Every action was timestamped. Every decision traceable. Every dollar tied directly to HOA authorization. The narrator never intervened. No cease and desist. No call to the sheriff. No emergency injunction. That silence convinced the board they were untouchable. They sent follow-up notices declaring the property returned to compliance. They discussed billing the owner for administrative oversight costs. Few residents applauded, relieved that the eyesore had been handled. Others weren't so comfortable. Quiet questions spread through the neighborhood. How could an HOA order work on land it didn't own? Why weren't permits checked? Why was there no court order? A few residents wondered privately what would happen if the board ever turned that kind of power on them. The board dismissed the concern. They had enforced a rule. They had asserted control, and the owner had folded. All of it, they believed, over a $200 violation. What the HOA failed to understand was this. They hadn't enforced anything. They had trespassed. They had vandalized. They had authorized the destruction of a legally protected seven-figure property beyond their jurisdiction, and they had done it all in writing. By the time the last truck pulled away and the lake went quiet again, the damage was irreversible. But the true cost hadn't surfaced yet. Because the narrator hadn't been avoiding conflict. They'd been letting the HOA construct the case line by line, invoice by invoice, decision by decision, against itself. The silence ends with paperwork, not an angry phone call, not a confrontation at the gate. Just envelopes thick ones, delivered by certified mail, process servers, and law firms that don't posture. That's when the truth finally lands. The narrator steps forward for the first time and makes one fact unmistakably clear. The HOA didn't damage a property they misunderstood. They destroyed a mansion that was owned outright, deeded, recorded, insured, and legally protected by the narrator personally. And that was only the beginning. Alongside proof of ownership of the lake house, the notices reveal something far more destabilizing. The shoreline buffer, the access corridors. Several parcels the HOA quietly depended on for roads, drainage, and view preservation. None of it was theirs. It never had been. Those areas existed only because the landowner had tolerated their use, not because the HOA owned them, not because rights were granted, because no one had ever bothered to check. Until now. The legal notices land like controlled detonations. Trespass documented, repeated, and authorized by board vote. Destruction of property, itemized down to materials, labor, and lost market value. Fraudulent enforcement proven through emails, meeting minutes, and invoices tied to a violation the HOA had no authority to issue. Each notice references exhibits. Each exhibit references video. Each video references names. There's nothing to reinterpret. That's when the HOA's attorneys finally step in and panic sets in almost immediately. Within days, the board learns what they actually authorize. Not an accident, not a misunderstanding. Intentional acts. Willful destruction. Actions taken outside jurisdiction, without ownership, permits, or court orders. Insurance pulls out just as fast. The denial letter is short and devastating. Intentional acts. No insurable interest. Unauthorized enforcement. Claim denied in full. Overnight, the dispute stops being abstract. Now it's personal. Board members stop answering each other's calls. Emergency meetings collapse into blame. One director insists they were following precedent. Another claims the property manager approved everything. The property manager produces emails showing the board ordered the work anyway. Residents start asking questions the board can't answer. Why were contractors allowed onto land the HOA didn't own? Why did a $200 violation turn into millions in damage? Why was no legal counsel consulted before tearing into a lakefront estate? There are no answers, only assumptions. And assumptions don't survive deeds. The narrator's attorneys pull county records. Plats confirm the boundaries. Shoreline rights are exclusive. The so-called view corridors exist only in HOA language, not in law. Even the original developer documents quietly admit the truth: the land was never conveyed. Only assumed to be cooperative. Assumed, never granted. As residents begin to understand the scope of the mistake, anxiety spreads. Property values wobble. Lenders start asking questions. Title companies flag the neighborhood for review. The HOA leadership realizes they didn't just overstep, they exposed everyone. All of it because they couldn't tolerate a house they didn't control. The narrator doesn't threaten, doesn't gloat, doesn't raise their voice. They let the facts sit on the table. Ownership, authority, evidence, and one final notice that changes everything. Any further entry onto the land will be treated as knowing trespass, with damages pursued personally. That's when the HOA finally understands. They didn't enforce a rule. They attacked the wrong property, the person they dismissed as an absentee nobody. Turns out they owned everything that mattered. The courtroom is quiet when the judge finishes reviewing the exhibits. Not tense, not dramatic. Quiet in the way a room gets when the decision is already made. Deeds, permits, drone footage, board meeting recordings, contractor invoices authorized by people who never had the authority to authorize anything. The HOA's case doesn't collapse all at once. It comes apart piece by piece. Their attorney leans on community standards. The judge looks up and asks a single question. Do you own the land? They don't. Everything after that is procedural. The ruling is blunt and impossible to misinterpret. The HOA acted outside its jurisdiction. It authorized trespass. It approved demolition without ownership, easement, consent, or court order. The $200 violation notice is dismissed, outright described by the court as irrelevant and legally meaningless, a justification without authority. Then the damages are read into the record. Full restoration costs, loss of market value, legal fees, punitive damages. The total climbs past the original value of the mansion. By the time the final number is stated, several board members are visibly shaken. But the real impact comes next. Because the actions were intentional, not accidental, not negligent, the court pierces the HOA's shield. Board members are held personally liable. Their volunteer status offers no protection. Their votes are recorded. Their emails are explicit. Their approvals are undeniable. The judge makes it clear. Authority abused is authority lost. The HOA's enforcement powers are suspended pending state review. Any future corrective actions now require independent oversight and legal approval. The board is effectively neutralized. The HOA didn't just lose a case. They lost control. Word spreads fast through the community. Residents who once applauded enforcement fall silent. Those who'd lived in quiet fear finally exhale. Property managers stop using words like mandatory and start using words like voluntary, paused and reviewed by council. And the narrator? As they rebuild? Not the same house, a better one. The new structure rises with upgraded materials, modern design, reinforced shoreline protections, and documentation so clean it borders on surgical. Every permit flawless, every boundary unmistakable. The estate isn't just valuable anymore, it's untouchable. Months later, the narrator walks the rebuilt shoreline. The lake is calm again, the trees are regrown, the house stands exactly as intended. No letters, no inspections, no friendly reminders, just silence. The irony is impossible to miss. The HOA destroyed a $10 million home over a $200 fine. They told themselves it was about rules, about order, about setting an example. What they actually did was erase their own future. They exposed themselves to liability they couldn't survive. They taught their residents to question authority. They proved that power without ownership is just noise. All because they never asked the simplest question first. Who actually owns this? They thought they were enforcing rules. They were dismantling themselves one illegal decision at a time.